the beauty of Marx's analysis in ecological terms is that Marx provided the only theoretical approach up to the present day, I think, that in a way that connected society and nature, and we say society and ecology together, that they were seen as essentially two sides of the same coin, that you couldn't talk about society without talking about social relation to nature. So he's got a completely unified analysis, which is penetrating. It really, it's not a question of a few phrases. It goes through his entire analysis. There's this relation between humanity and nature through social production. And if we don't get it right, if we don't sustain the earth for future generations, which is another thing that he talked about, then we're going to have ecological crises and essentially destroy ourselves.
Hello and welcome. I'm Lynn Fries, producer of Global Political Economy, or GPE News Docs. That opening short was on Marx's ecology, and a quick preview of what's coming up in this segment. This is part one of a four-part series with John Bellamy Foster unpacking a trilogy: Marx's Ecology, Materialism and Nature, The Return of Nature, Socialism and Ecology, and Breaking the Bonds of Fate, Epicurus and Marx. This first segment features Bellamy Foster's overview of this trilogy and his comments on Marx's ecology. John Bellamy Foster is editor of Monthly Review and professor of sociology at the University of Oregon. He's a prolific author, co-author, and editor. As well as today's features books and many others, he's authored Capitalism in the Anthropocene, The Dialectics of Ecology, and co-authored The Robbery of Nature and the Ecological Rift. Bellamy Foster's work has been awarded numerous distinctions. His book, The Return of Nature, won the Deutscher Memorial Prize. In this opening segment, the first thing I asked our guest to clarify was why he says Breaking the Bonds of Fate is logically the first book of the trilogy. We go now to part one of this series as John Bellamy Foster responds to that question.
Well, first of all, I mean, it is a little confusing because the first book written in this trilogy was Marx's Ecology, and it did deal with materialism, Epicurus, and so on. And then The Return of Nature is the second book written. But the third book written is actually the beginning of the trilogy. That's Breaking the Bonds of Fate is logically the beginning. I went back and explained the foundations more fully. Marx's Ecology is the first book written. Return of Nature is the second book written, and the Breaking the Bonds of Fate is the third book written, but actually the foundation for the whole trilogy.
We're going to be talking about each of these books one by one in the order in which they were written. But first comment on how you came to write this trilogy, and then run through a brief overview.
Well, I got interested in the question of Marx and ecology, and I originally wrote an article for a German dictionary on Erde, Earth, and they wanted me to talk about the classical political economy and the soil, and also Marx's role. And I discovered the full depth of Marx's ecological analysis, influenced by the German chemist Justus von Liebig. And I wrote about that, and then I developed that into an article called Marx's Theory of Metabolic Rift that explained Marx's ecological analysis in Capital, or at least the core of it, in terms of what was called the theory of metabolic rift, which we'll talk about. But it's his theory of ecological crisis, and focused initially on the soil. And I wanted to know how Marx could have possibly done that. Like, if you assume that Marx was a genius, it's still a genius can't make bricks without straw, as the saying goes. So there had to be some foundations. How was it that Marx was able to intervene so fully into what was an ecological discussion at enormous depth and connect the social and natural in what we now call an ecological way? How could he do that? He was not primarily a natural scientist. Where did he get the foundations for that? And I decided the answer had to be in Marx's materialism. But that raised a question. I had come out of the Western Marxist tradition. I'd been trained in economics and philosophy, and there really wasn't an answer to that. When people talked about Marx's materialism, they generally meant his economics, and nothing more than that, and or it wasn't examined. So I felt I needed to discover where Marx's materialism came from and really what the roots of it were. And so I went back to his doctoral dissertation. The principal problem, of course, was that, well, Marx wrote about the materialist conception of history. There was also a materialist conception of nature. And where did that come from? And how did Marx tie into that? So I went back to his doctoral dissertation on Epicurus, on the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus, who lived from 341 to 270 BCE. So that's thousands of years before, but Marx had written his doctoral dissertation on Epicurus's philosophy of nature, and that had always been a puzzle for analysts of Marx's work. But it was there that I searched for the origins of Marx's materialism. Obviously, Marx was influenced by Hegel's idealist philosophy, but where and when did he embrace materialism, and what did that mean? And so I found a lot of the answers in Marx's doctoral dissertation, and explained in Marx's Ecology. I explained some of Epicurean materialism. I had to study Epicurus' philosophy itself, and I explained some of that. And then I wrote the book, Marx's Ecology, basically about 19th century materialism, centering on Marx, but also taking into account other thinkers like Darwin and Liebig and Malthus. Of course, Liebig and Malthus weren't strictly materialists. They weren't materialists, but I dealt with a whole lot of thinkers who were, including Darwin, and tried to understand, the development of ecology centering on Marx and rooted in this notion of materialism, of the human dependence on nature and natural conditions. So I did that, and the book, Marx's Ecology, was subtitled Materialism Nature. And the book was a success in terms of explaining Marx's ecology and getting people to recognize that. But then I immediately came into, there immediately were criticisms that, well, this didn't continue. What Marx did with respect to ecology and materialism was erased later on. It didn't have any effect on the later development of either Marxism or ecology. So I wrote The Return of Nature, Socialism and Ecology, which took me about 20 years. Of course, I was doing other things as well. And that explained the story, that told the story from the time of the death of Darwin and Marx in 1882, 1883, respectively, up until the 1980s. And it showed how this materialist view, ecological materialism, had grown out of Marx and Darwin and had been promoted in socialist thought, and that resulted in concepts like the concept of ecosystem and many other breakthroughs up through the ecological movement of, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So that story was told in The Return of Nature. And then after that, I could go back to what was the essential problem. I could go back to Epicurus and Marx and really do a thorough job this time of analyzing Epicurean philosophy and Marx's dissertation and how that had affected much of Marx's thought, which we don't recognize today or have ignored. And so I did that in Breaking the Bonds of Fate. And Breaking Bonds of Fate has 4 chapters. One is on Epicurus's life and times in ancient Athens. The second is on his philosophy. The third is on Marx's dissertation and how Epicurus influenced Marx and how he developed these ideas. And the fourth chapter is on Epicureanism and Marxism, on how this permeated much of Marxism. So I did that, but in going back and looking at Epicurus again, and I had actually been reading the materials for a couple of decades. I'd collected, and I decided that Epicurus in his time was a figure of the same stature as Marx in his, in the sense that Epicureanism was the most influential philosophy in ancient times, both in terms of adherence and in terms of duration. It lasted for 7 centuries as a school, and I discovered just the profundity of Marx's analysis. But another thing happened, and that was I got more deeply into the current Epicurean scholarship, which a lot of it is based on the discoveries. When Mount Vesuvius went off in 79 AD, it buried not only Pompeii, but Herculaneum, which was a Roman resort town. And in what we call the Villa of the Papyri, they discovered the only existing ancient library, the only still existing ancient library. It had the papyri. Thousands of papyri had been turned into what looked like carbonized lumps of coal, but they were able to unroll them to some extent, developing machines, destroying a lot in the process. Now we have very advanced techniques for reading them, and they were able to discover all sorts of Epicurean works because it was an Epicurean library, including parts of a crucial part of Book 25 of Epicurus's On Nature. And Marx had developed a very unique analysis of Epicurean philosophy, seeing it as a materialism that left room for human agency and contingency and development and human freedom, a dialectic of determinism and freedom. And it was a very unique interpretation, and they sort of rediscovered Marx's interpretation in the early 20th century and realized that, let's say, in the analysis of some parts of Epicurus, like the Epicurean swerve, he was way ahead of modern, of Epicurean scholarship, even in the 20th century. But with the discovery of the papyri, we've discovered that Marx's fundamental interpretation of Epicurus was correct, and that Marx's whole interpretation of freedom and determinism in Epicurus and the dialectical basis of it and so on has been verified by modern scholarships. What do we get out of this? Well, Marx got out of it a materialism that was active, that was not mechanical. Epicurus rejected mechanistic views, mechanical materialism. He rejected idealism. He rejected skepticism. He sort of, as Marx said, swerved away from all of that and came up with a view that took into account nature and society, that took into account a degree of determinism, causal determinism, but left room for human freedom, and that, what had a proto-evolutionary perspective, had a notion of what we call emergence, that takes into consideration the role of organization in and this is fundamental to science now, that we have certain physical properties and you could say atoms, but we also have organization, and between the two, we have a complete view of the world where there are emergent levels, and that's very important because it goes against any kind of reductionism. Marx was very anti-reductionist, and of course he got that a lot from Epicurus. So Epicurus also influenced the whole 17th century scientific revolution, and the Enlightenment. So all of the major thinkers were indebted to Epicurus and said so. And it was part of the development of materialism. It was part of the development of the Enlightenment. And Marx knew that, and that's why he was interested. But it was fundamental because Marx had spent his time studying Hegelian idealism, but he was really inclined to materialism. But how do you construct a materialism that is ontological, that deals with the nature of being, that's epistemological, that is has an explanation of how we know things, and that's also practical, that deals with real conditions. And Epicurus, for Marx, was a plus because he was very critical of religion or teleology, the notion that the gods or God determined things on earth. He rejected that without rejecting religion completely. And he emphasized that the basis of human life was community, friendship, building a society based on friendship. He was the first to bring women into philosophy, making them allowing them to emerge as major philosophers within the Epicurean school, and also slaves. He couldn't do anything about slavery itself, but he brought slaves into Epicurean philosophy. They were given high status, and the whole society was organized around a garden and emphasized sustainable living, very ecological in orientation. Epicurus criticized those who thought that enough was too little. So, and because the idea is that enough, everyone needs enough, but no one needs more than that. He emphasized that justice was based on reciprocity, and he said that justice, the conditions of justice changed, or justice changed depending on changes in material conditions. We have from Lucretius, his major follower, a very historical approach to anthropological historical approach to human development. So all of these things attracted Marx. And he found in Epicurus what he called an immanent dialectic, that he saw Epicurus as the first thinker to develop a concept of alienation. So he was able to take his background in Hegelian philosophy and study Epicurus and imagine a new kind of analysis, a materialism that was an active materialism that was oriented to praxis, that had a role for human agency, and was aimed at freedom and equality and human development and so on. So Marx quoted Epicurus Lucretius on breaking the bonds of fate. Epicurus was always about breaking the bonds of fate and making room for conceptions of human freedom without renouncing materialism or determination to some degree. So that was crucial to Marx. How do we break the bonds of fate and recognize that the world is up to us. We can change the world, and all of this is in the Epicurus and Marx relationship. And while I started out looking at materialism from the standpoint of ecology, and this is all the development of an ecological materialism, it also deals with these other issues, like how do we conceive of human freedom in a world that is also partly determined.
So there's a lot to unpack here. So we're going to take these books one by one, starting with the first book written, so Marx's Ecology. You said in this first book you tried to understand the development of ecology rooted in this notion of materialism, so of the human dependence on nature and natural conditions. You published an article on Marx's theory of ecological crisis, Marx's theory of metabolic rift, and you needed to find out where Marx got these ecological insights. And for that, the Western Marxist tradition had no answers. Having decided Marx's ecological insights had to come from his materialism, to discover the foundations of that materialism, you went back to Marx's doctoral dissertation, titled The Difference Between the Democritean and Epicurean Philosophies of Nature. As explained in Breaking the Bonds of Fate, Marx's doctoral thesis had generally been treated in the Western Marxist philosophical tradition as an immature product of his early Hegelian idealist phase. Departing from the dominant tradition in this respect, Marx's Ecology presented Epicurus' materialist philosophy as the nascent basis on which he'd begun to work out a materialist dialectic, inverting Hegel's idealist system. And for this, you say, Marx was able to take his background in Hegelian philosophy and his study of Epicurus and imagine an active materialism that had a role for human agency and that was aimed at freedom and equality and human development and so on. As we talk about this first book, let's start with this notion of materialism. So Marx's Ecology emphasizes the necessary connection between materialism and ecology, which is stated in the book's intro is the whole point of the study. And then goes on to clarify this notion of materialism and state, quote, in its most general sense, materialism claims that the origin and development of whatever exists is dependent on nature and matter. That is, a level of physical reality that's independent of and prior to thought. The book then goes on to clarify the notion of materialism in the terms that you just referred to in your overview of the trilogy: an ontological materialism, an epistemological materialism, and a practical materialism. Can you expand on the explanation you already gave on what all that means?
Well, the best thinker on this is Roy Bhaskar, and a lot of his writings are very difficult, and I've plowed through them. But what I would recommend the most is he wrote an essay, which I first encountered in Tom Bottomore's Dictionary of Marxism. He wrote an essay on materialism, which he then was included in some of his later works and developed on. But Bhaskar is very clear. There's three levels of materialism: ontological, that is the nature of being; epistemological, then how we know, the basis of human knowledge; and the third one is practical or praxis, where materialism is seen as, it's more like what we think in terms of economic struggle or struggle over the class, material conditions of production, and so on. At the level of praxis, materialism represents, starting with those material foundations, which means human production and seeing that as the basis of society and social action. But ontological materialism means that we have to have some kind of notion of what the material base is, and in that Epicurus, before him Democritus, they were atomists. They said it all came from atoms, except that Epicurus made that into less of a rigid, fatalistic sort of theory. But that there were, we talk in terms of subatomic particles and everything else, but the idea is that there's a physical material basis to the universe, to the earth, to our own existence, and we have to start with that. That defines what, at the most basic level, what is and what is possible. And then there's question of how do we know things? And the Epicurean approach says we know things primarily through our senses. The materialist approach always starts with the senses, with empirical analysis, starting with the conditions, the material conditions. Well, a more idealist approach starts with religion or the mind, or so on. Hegel in his Phenomenology once said that these approaches are sometimes, it can almost be viewed as equivalent, but they have different starting points, that they both represent, absolutes, like you make nature the absolute, or you make God the absolute, but you have different starting points. The materialist approach always starts with nature, material conditions, and how do we know things? We know things first through our senses, and then we build up our mind. Our mind develops, and there's a whole evolutionary process I won't get into, but basically that's the approach. We know from what we physically experience and how we rationally learn to perceive and examine that, rather than final causes. There's no teleological principle that establishes some final end that's ultimately determined by God, and ideas aren't floating signifiers that come out of nowhere or come out of, like Athena from the head of Zeus. You have to, in the materialist view, start with the basis of physical existence, and our own existence is based on our subsistence on Earth. That means through our production and how we therefore meet our needs. So that's a fundamental materialist approach, and it's rooted in a kind of ontology that says that nature is and the physical existence is basic to this. Science sees things this way. So we think of physics as the most basic science. But physics can't explain society, because even though physics explains a lot of what are the fundamental conditions of the world in material terms, society is what we call an emergent level or an integrative level that has its own laws, right? It can't be simply reduced to physics or biology or anything like that. So, but a materialist approach does that, and it seems strange because science is so much seen as the enemy of ecology. Some environmentalists, often within green theory, that science becomes the enemy. And science can be very destructive, right? But our notions of ecology, all of our fundamental notions, ecological notions like metabolism, ecosystem, the earth system, they all come out of science and out of a materialist perspective, and this is fundamental. And this is one of the reasons why Marx was able to advance so far in this.
So in the introduction to Marx's Ecology, you say that, to quote, the argument of this book is based on a very simple premise, that in order to understand the origins of ecology, it's necessary to comprehend the new views of nature that arose with the development of materialism and science from the 17th through 19th centuries. Moreover, rather than simply picturing materialism and science as the enemies of earlier and supposedly preferable conceptions of nature, as is common in contemporary green theory, the emphasis here is on how the development of both materialism and science promoted, indeed made possible, ecological ways of thinking. So comment more on what you were saying there.
That's essentially saying that the answer lies in materialism. And those ideas that arose in the 17th through the 19th century, that new materialism, let's say, Francis Bacon, for example, or Voltaire in a different way, they were all influenced by Epicurean philosophy, to some extent Democritus, but it was mostly Epicureanism. They had more from Epicurus, but also the Lucretius was very important. Epicurus's great Roman follower. So the 17th century scientific revolution was really a revolt against Aristotelian scholasticism that had been attached to the church, to basically the Catholic Church in the medieval era. And in the Renaissance, but much more in the 17th century scientific revolution, they broke away from that Aristotelian scholasticism in the understanding of nature by way primarily of Epicurus, Democritus and Epicurus, and they came up with another understanding. For one thing, the understanding which is basic to materialism and to evolutionary thought, that nature is its own explanation, that it was the rejection of final causes and teleology and the examination of nature. So in Aristotle, there were four causes, and two of them were material causes, and then there's final causes, which was always the ultimate cause was always God, the final causes. And Bacon said that final causes were like vestal virgins; they were barren. He always used metaphors. But the idea was that they were the final causes were consecrated to God, so they told us nothing about nature, and they were barren in the understanding of nature. We had to approach things in a materialist and empirical way, and it's interesting to me that Bacon said that, but then Darwin quoted that same phrase when in the 1840s when he was developing his ideas, because Darwin was struggling with materialism all through his life, which out of which his evolutionary theory came. And Marx quoted in the 1840s that same phrase from Bacon about a year from Darwin. They all were reorienting themselves to a view that nature was its own explanation, that nature created itself, that God was not responsible. And all of this sort of went back to the roots of materialism and Epicurus. So there was a whole scientific revolution going on. And the ecology cannot really be meaningfully approached, I believe, except on a materialist and realist basis. The idea that the ecology is, something that we can get just spiritually. I mean, the spiritual elements are important, or that, it just comes from some sort of sense of intrinsic nature. That isn't enough. We really needed a materialist understanding and a scientific, a realist understanding, and that's what emerged at this time. And ecology actually arose out of the understanding of materialism.
In the introduction to Marx's Ecology, you go on to say, the overall discussion is structured around the work of Darwin and Marx, the two greatest materialists of the 19th century. But it's the latter who constitutes the principal focus of this work, since the goal is to understand and develop a revolutionary ecological view of great importance to us today, one that links social transformation with the transformation of the human relation with nature in ways that we now consider ecological. The key to Marx's thinking in this respect, it's contended, lies in the way that he developed and transformed an existing Epicurean tradition with respect to materialism and freedom, which was integral to the rise of much of modern scientific and ecological thought. Expand on that, and notably why you chose Marx's analysis as the principal focus of this work.
Yeah, I mean, one of the beauty of Marx's analysis in ecological terms is that Marx provided the only theoretical approach up to the present day, I think, that in a way that connected society and nature, and we say society and ecology together, that they were seen as essentially two sides of the same coin, that you couldn't talk about society without talking about the social relation to nature, but at the same time it wasn't reductionist like a biological determinism or any kind of a naturalistic determinism. He perceived the role of the social in all of this, but never separated the social from the natural material conditions. And this approach led to his ecological crisis theory, what we call the theory of metabolic rift. Well, that's sort of a shorthand for a lot of other things. And Marx introduced the notion of the universal metabolism of nature. If you want to talk about nature, you talk about it as a universal metabolism. And he took the concept of metabolism that had been developed in the 19th century, and he expanded on it in social terms. So first you have the universal metabolism of nature, but what do human beings do when they produce? When we produce and transform nature, he called that the social metabolism. The social metabolism, which is really production, in Marxist terms, is what connects human beings to nature, and it's what allows us to live. And he came up with this notion of the metabolic rift, well, an interruption in a rupture, a rift, irreparable rift in the interdependent social metabolism between nature and society. And the idea was that we developed an alienated social metabolism, an alienated production that's destructive of the universal metabolism of nature, and that this is particularly prominent in capitalism, which tends to rob nature and treat it as a free gift and has anything but a sustainable relation to nature. We create this irreparable rift in the interdependent social metabolism between nature and society, and that has to be reconciled, but it can't really be reconciled within the kind of system that we have. And all of this came out of Marx's materialism. And if you look at Lucretius, Epicurus's follower, there is a place where he refers to essentially the irreparable rift or irreparable rupture when talking about death. And Marx is saying, what we're doing is killing ourselves and the earth, or the human relation to the earth, by having an alienated social metabolism that's in conflict with the universal metabolism of nature. And he ties this back to capital accumulation. So he's got a completely unified analysis, which is penetrating. It really, it's not a question of a few phrases. It goes through his entire analysis. There's this relation between humanity and nature through social production. And if we don't get it right, if we don't sustain the earth for future generations, which is another thing that he talked about, then we're going to have ecological crises and essentially destroy ourselves. So all of that is in Marx, and it comes out of this very unified materialist perspective. And Darwin is another matter. Darwin was not concerned with ecological crisis, but Darwin does teach us a lot about evolution, and that came from a materialist perspective. It's been discovered in recent scholarship in the last few decades just how much, or last half century, how much Darwin was a materialist in his notebooks, and how it's clear in his notebooks, and he tried to hide his materialism because of the religious views in England at the time. And his evolutionary theory came out of his materialism. And if you understand, I think, the implications of Darwin fully, it doesn't really come back down to just the survival of the fittest, as we say. There, you can get out of Darwin or Darwinian thinking a notion that we have to co-evolve with the earth. So this is extremely important.
As a follow-on to your comments that Marx had a completely unified materialist perspective, I should note for viewers that there's an in-depth and multifaceted discussion of this running through all three books. While it's not possible to do justice to this in today's conversation, there are some summary points about this in Breaking the Bonds of Fate that I find myself constantly referring back to, and of special relevance to the story told in The Return of Nature. On the view other generalists may also find this useful background for today's discussion, I'll take a moment to quickly run through those now. From the beginning, Marx's materialism could be said to have two sides, the ecological and the economic. This was later manifested in his development in Capital of his theory of the metabolic rift. To understand the full dialectical character of his thought, his underlying materialist conception of nature is as vital as the materialist conception of history. There is, in the end, only one materialism. If Marx's general philosophical outlook can be called dialectical critical materialist or dialectical critical realist, his distinctive contribution was the materialist conception of history, or historical materialism. Without a thorough materialist grounding in the material world at large, including Earth itself, historical materialism was without grounds. Hence, Marx and Engels, throughout their work, sought to ground their critique of bourgeois society and historical forms in the much wider context of the earthly conditions of existence. All of their texts continuously referred back to this. Nevertheless, the vast changes in natural science in the 19th century and the development of a crude mechanism often accompanied by a crude idealism, forced the development in chronological terms of a second foundation of Marxism, underlying the first, that is, a materialist dialectics that would counter the prevailing mechanistic materialism. This was a task clearly recognized and taken on by both Marx and Engels. But given Marx's desperate efforts to complete his critique of political economy, which tied him down considerably, the integration of historical materialism with the materialist conception of nature via the explicit development of a dialectical naturalism fell largely to Engels and Anti-Düring and his unfinished Dialectics of Nature. If the first foundation of classical Marxism was therefore the materialist conception of history, in which a materialist conception of nature was largely assumed, the second foundation was the development of a dialectical natural conception of the physical world and of life as a necessary basis for moving forward. The second foundation of Marxism was thus a return of nature, and thus a dialectical integration of the materialist conception of history with the materialist concept of nature that led to major developments in cultural theory, natural science, and ecology. With that as a lead-in, let's turn now to the next book of the trilogy that we're going to be discussing, The Return of Nature, Socialism and Ecology. What then was your focus and goal in writing this book? And how does the story you began in Marx's Ecology carry over into The Return of Nature? John Bellamy Foster's response to that question and more follows in part 2. We're going to break here. This has been part 1 of a 4-part series with John Bellamy Foster on a trilogy, Marx's Ecology, The Return of Nature, and Breaking the Bonds of Fate. Many thanks to guest John Bellamy Foster. And thank you for joining us.